Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure to open this very special event celebrating Joe Wolf's work and, most importantly, Joe the person. My name is Shai Agmon. I'm a fellow here at New College. Yeah, there's my slide. And Joe was my DPhil supervisor and fortunately still a mentor and a friend. Actually, many of our supervision meetings took place during the pandemic. So instead of sitting in this beautiful building, we walked masked with a couple of meters between us up and down the Thames in East London. And every time, Joe would do three things, every time. First, he would tell me to kind of lift my head from the weeds of argumentation and explain in simple terms what I was trying to say and why it mattered. Every argument can be refuted, he liked to remind me, and the real question is what your contribution is. Easy, right? Second, he'd ask me about my family, my friends, and life outside academia. And third, he'd spend a good portion of the meeting, telling stories about the history of philosophy, his own family, a strange twist in the career of some long-forgotten thinker, or about a public park or library we'd pass, always illuminating, always funny, and always somehow actually relevant to my work. Now, in planning this event, I tried to follow Joe's lead. We've focused on big ideas. We've connected Joe's philosophical contribution to his family, history, and public policy work. And we've asked friends and colleagues to tell stories of Joe, of themselves, and of the world they think and care about. So here's how the day is structured, as you'll see on your programs that you got when you entered the building. We begin with 4 thematic panels reflecting Joe's main area of contribution, so engaged philosophy, just and unjust cities, health and disability, and equality. In each panel, at least one of the speakers or chair is or was Joe's student, and I think that's especially meaningful and a testament to kind of the breadth and depth of Joe's influence across generations. Then in the final session, we will hear from Professor Nairi Woods, Dean of the School, and Professor Avner Deshalit, Joe's longtime friend and co-author. That will lead into a wider conversation onto the role of public philosophy in Jewish political thought in the 20th century, and we will end, as we should, with a talk by Joe himself. Now, to the fun part of my short remarks, I have the honor of taking us through a few logistical notes to keep the day running smoothly. So we have a very full agenda today, and we will aim to begin each session on time as much as possible. So please try to be back in your seats promptly after each break, and I will kind of shout at you from time to do that. Coffee will be available during breaks in the forum, just outside the room where you just were. Lunch and the drinks reception will also take place there. Please wear your name tags throughout the day. There's another event happening in the building, and this helps avoid confusion. Speakers and chairs, please come at the stage around 10 minutes before your session begins so we can prepare microphones and presentations. The toilets are just outside on this floor. Finally, a word on safety and recordings. So in the unlikely event of a fire alarm, please exit calmly following the green signs that you can see and staff instructions. The assembly point is in front of the building by the fountain pen sculpture. If you may need assistance, please let reception know. And the event is being live stream, recorded, and photographed. Some of the footage may appear on the school's website or other platforms. So if you prefer not to appear on camera, just email the email address that is now on the screen. And please do take a moment now to silence your phones. That is all from me for now. If you need anything during the day, I, along with the brilliant team of the Blavatnik School, will be around and happy to help. Speaking of which, my warmest thanks to Jolie, Anna, Professor Tom Simpson, Jennifer, and the rest of the school staff. that are with us today. This is seriously, the most professional events team I've ever worked with, and it has been a real joy putting this day together with you. So thank you all again for being here and for coming from all over the UK and abroad. I'm truly excited for this day, and Joe, most of all, I hope you enjoy it. Now, please join me in welcoming our first two speakers, Eniola Shuemi, Senior Research Fellow in Political Philosophy and Public Policy here at the school, and Lior Erez Alfred Landecker, Postdoctoral Fellow, also here at the school. Eniola and Lior, the floor is yours.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Joe, for existing so we can have this day in honor of you. So most of the day is going to be spent talking about Joe's intellectual and philosophical influence and contribution. So I thought I'd start off in a similar vein to how Shai has kicked us off, talking about a slightly different aspect of Joe. It's funny, I did my master's at UCL, which is where Joe spent much of his career, and I never met him. I met Joe for the first time doing the interview for my first job here. And I remember the night before the interview, foolishly, or maybe not so foolishly, given that I'm standing here, I went out for drinks with friends instead of having an early night. And I asked those friends, I said, I've got an interview at the Blavatnik school tomorrow, and Joe Wolf's on my interview panel. What's he like? And they said, yeah, he's really nice. He's really nice. You'll like him. You'll love him, actually. He's really nice. And I'm a skeptical sort of person. So I might have raised an eyebrow or two at the thought that I would love the person who was about to interview me for my first faculty job. Now, I must say it's been 3 years since I got that job. And those friends were not wrong, but they weren't completely forthcoming, because Joe isn't just nice. He is immensely kind. He is unbelievably generous with his time and with his thoughts and with his ideas. He has read works of mine that really shouldn't have crossed anyone's email chain yet. You know, he is thoughtful, he is caring. And it has been an absolute honor to be a close colleague of his for the last 3 years. And more importantly than that, Joe and I always, when we chat, we talk about other academics. Nobody in this room, obviously. And the first thing I always say is, yeah, but are they a good person? They're really smart, but are they a good person? And I think that's something Joe and I have in common. We really care about that aspect of people, and it's amazing to have worked with somebody for these last 3 years. In my first faculty role, who has that outlook professionally and personally. And so it has been, I found myself to be incredibly fortunate and lucky to have found in him not just a close colleague, but a mentor and a friend. Now, Joe has this tic that I found out about, which is that apparently, and this may or may not be genetic, I can't say, but he can't sit still for more than 90 minutes at an event. His wife is nodding, so it's true. 90 is generous. Now, this is a weird tic for an academic, right? Because we take a long time. But if anybody deserves to have to sit through a whole day absorbing how immense his influence and contribution has been, it's Joe Wolf. Thank you.
Thank you, Eniola. This was a very hard act to follow, but I'll still try. So lovely to see all of you here today, and a genuine pleasure to open this event in honor of Joe. So I've been working with Joe for the last 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow, and I've been trying to think how best to introduce this conference and this event. And I thought the best way to do it is with my introduction with Joe. But in fact, my introduction with Joe was not when he interviewed me for the job or when we started working together. My introduction was with a sentence that you might be familiar with. This is a quote you may have come across. And the quote is this. It has been said that there are only two questions in political philosophy: who gets what and who says who. Now, for quite a lot of people, myself included, and maybe some other people in the room, this was your first introduction to Joe and maybe to political philosophy more generally. This is, of course, the opening sentence of the Introduction of Political Philosophy. And Introduction is one of those rare books that manages to be both clear and serious about some very important topics, being genuinely thoughtful about these topics, but also being very clear and accessible. So when I came back to the sentence some years after first reading it, it struck me how much this one sentence captures almost the essence of Joe's approach to political philosophy and to thinking in general. It takes a complex questions and debates, and immediately cuts to the core of the problem, showing us why this is an important question, while at the same time being clear, accessible, and a little bit funny. In one of Joe's more memorable Guardian columns that I came across during my extensive research for this speech, Joe complains about academic writing and asks why reading academic writing is often such a chore and so rarely a joy. I can happily confirm that this was never the case with Joe's writing. But of course, Joe's influence doesn't stop at his academic work. And one of the things I admire most about Joe, again, to knowing him both personally and professionally, is the way he's taking philosophical thinking into public life. And we'll see a lot of this in the event today with the breadth of topics that are going to be discussed today. Whether it's through his columns in The Guardian, or his public advocacy, or his role in various public committees, and indeed his prodigious tweeting. Joe has consistently shown how philosophy can make real contribution to the way we think about our world. And remarkably, Joe has done all of that without ever being self-important about it. If anything, Joe is known, as Neil said, and many of you know, for doing quite the opposite, for asking thoughtful, often deceptively simple questions, and for cutting through jargon or complexity to get to the heart of the issue. And this is a rare skill, and it's part of what makes Joe's work so valuable, both in and outside academia. So today is really about celebrating, as Shai said, not just Joe's work, but Joe as a person, the many ways he's shaped the people and conversations around him. And we're very glad to have the chance to say thank you for all of that you've done. And I would like to invite the first panel on Engaged Philosophy to take the stage. Thank you very much, Joe.
So, thank you, Shai, and welcome to the very first session. Just before I introduce our really incredible speakers, I thought I had probably better introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Alice Evett. I'm a research fellow in the Environmental Change Institute and Oxford Net Zero, where I work on climate policies, particularly how do we scale the most difficult technologies that we desperately need to get to net zero. But prior to that, and first and foremost, I'm also a philosopher. And I had the great honor to be supervised by Joe during my PhD here, where I looked at climate emergencies and what climate emergency policies should look like. I think, for me, the supervisions that I had with Joe were kind of, for anyone who wasn't lucky enough to have Joe as a supervisor, it's the quintessential Oxford experience, I would say. So you would be, absolutely, it's the kind of what you envision when you think of coming to Oxford, because you would be sat in Joe's office, and as we've heard from speakers before, you would be having a conversation that would span many different topics, and he would mention an idea, and then he would reach for the book itself with the quote and open to the very page. And I'm quite worried that I've still got a few books on loan. And so it was a real pleasure to be supervised by Joe, and how fitting it is that we are here to celebrate the public philosopher, a day in the honor of Joe Wolfe, right? And I'm so grateful to Shai and everyone for putting this together, because, as Joe might be able to tell you later, ceremonies are very, very important. Very important. And they play, I believe, a central role in human life and society. And I know this because Joe recently brought my attention to it. He's done some writing on the value of ceremonies, which I believe will be published soon. And one of the most interesting things, well, before I get ahead of myself, what is a ceremony? Right? Every good philosopher needs a definition. To draw on Joe's work, an out of the ordinary event, that take us out of the routine of society into what he describes as the liminal space. You get transported out of normal time to a special location for a special event, and the ordinary pressures of business and routine are suspended. So I, for one, have put on my out of office. And I think the primary function of a ceremony is that it makes us discover and think on what is important to us as a group and what is important to us as individuals. And it's very clear that from this event that Joe is very, very important. And so let's now move on to the first session, which is on engaged philosophy. And it's my pleasure to introduce first Professor Ingrid Robeens. Ingrid holds the chair in ethics of institutions at Utrecht University. She's published on the capability approach, the ideal, non-ideal debate in political philosophy, and various questions related to social and distributive justice. Her most recent book, which I think I missed out on last night, it was at Blackwell's, I very much wanted to go, is on libertarianism, the case against extreme wealth. And Ingrid has also edited the volume on pluralizing political philosophy. And next, we have Dr. Vafa Ghazavi, who is a lecturer in political science and public philosophy at the University of Sydney. I'm an alumni. He was previously an Australian diplomat and advisor in the Prime Minister's department before studying public administration at Harvard University as a Fulbright scholar, and then his doctorate under Joe here at Oxford as the John Monash Scholar. Before taking his current appointment, Vafa was the inaugural Executive Director for Research and Policy at the Australian Public Policy Institute, which was a joint venture between government and universities to advance policy innovation in the public interest. And I'm sure fertile ground for engaged philosophy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ingrid.
Yes. Let me see. Well, thank you for, first of all, to Shai and the team for organizing this and bringing us together. I'm honored to be here and also very happy. And I'm just looking forward not only to pay tribute to Joe, but also to just have fun. So, and I'm also going to do a bit of classical or traditional political philosophy, because I think if everybody just spends the whole day saying how much they're grateful to Joe, he may at some point just leave the room. So I will also try to I'm actually going to try to advance Joe's research agenda a little bit. But of course I cannot avoid the question that I guess everybody will be asked to answer, and that Philippe van Parijs asked me yesterday when I saw him in Brussels in the Eurostar terminal: where did you meet Joe first? Well, I met Joe first. The answer I gave to Philippe was at the priority in practice meetings, which actually was afterwards I thought was not true, because Serena Alzoretti once put up a conference on dessert when I was a PhD student in Cambridge, and that's where I met you. But I don't think I spoke to you because I was too intimidated by all the people in the room. But the priority in practice network, that was something. So I want to ask you, whom of you has been at a priority in practice meeting? Yeah, still some people, but you know, so there's lots of people who don't know what this is. I'm going to tell you a bit of history, very important history. This is what you can find if you Google Priority in Practice Jonathan Wolff. And so the Priority in Practice was a series of events so you can see here where they started in 2003 and went on, I think, to 2009, and then possibly were revived. But what is interesting for the first session on engaged philosophy is what this was trying to do. And I'll read you, because it's very small print, I'll read you a couple of sentences. So it's a research network. The overall goal of the network is to bring together an international and interdisciplinary group to explore how abstract theories of equality, can be used to inform actual public policy decision-making, and at the same time to consider where current theories are adequate for this purpose. A few sentences later, however, many academics in this area work at such a level of abstraction that their theories have no clear application to policy. And then, a few sentences later, the ultimate aim of the project is to bridge the gap between theory and practice so that academics can make a sustained contribution to the formation and development of public policy. That has, of course, been a thread through Joe Wolff's work. But what I found interesting is that the formulation was still about the theories, whereas, of course, what has happened with the shift from what Joe then called applied philosophy to engaged philosophy is really to dethrone the theories and move bottom up from, that's what I will talk about different methods and different approaches that do not prioritize theories. Joe has been clear all along, and other engaged philosophers too, that theories still have a played a role, but it has really been, in my view, a paradigm shift. And I now want to know from Joe, what role this played this series of events, because clearly there was still, okay, we'll leave that for the Q&A. I have questions, let me put it like this. So what happened between 2003 and 2025? So I think many things happened. I think the ideal, non-ideal debate definitely also played a role in this, because the people who were contributing to this debate, especially those who identified as non-ideal philosophers, were unhappy with the degree to which those theories could be used for addressing real-world problems. There also became a debate on feasibility, which is crucial because I think what seems to be the consensus in the literature is that if you want to do policy-relevant research, feasibility does play a role. There is a whole debate about what feasibility means. Actually, the ideal, non-ideal debate, at some point, I became so disillusioned with it, because what the debate started to do was to theorize about what the ideal, non-ideal distinction was. Which was like, when I entered that debate, I thought we have to have a discussion how to do political philosophy for the real world. But instead, again, it was moved to this very high level of abstraction. The feasibility debate has a bit of the same distinctions about distinctions, but there is one relevant one that I want to point out, because it will become relevant later on, which is that feasibility is different things. And one of the relevant distinctions is between stability, which is if you have a view of an institution, say a certain policy, or even an economic system, say you're advocating for whatever you want to say democratic socialism, is that stable? If we were to get there, do we have human nature, economic forces, whatever you want, to keep that system or that institution stable? Or will there just be a massive, in the case of a policy, overruling of a law? Because then you may have an institution that you have designed, but it cannot be stable. So stability is a relevant desiderata if you want to think about policy. Accessibility is How can we get there? And there, of course, accessibility may be too much of a requirement, because what is not accessible now may become accessible in the future. And yeah, so that is, I think, a relevant distinction. I use stability, accessibility. I know that Philip has other words, Olin Wright also has other words, but these are the words that are most frequently used in the literature. Now, what I also then think happened was that an increasing number of political philosophers really started to move from doing this theory-driven work to this more bottom-up work. And here, Joe has played an absolutely crucial and key role, perhaps the key role, although there's a broader group of people doing this. He mentioned Amartya Sen often in his work, and Iris Marion Young. But so we have shifted from doing applied in the sense of take a theory and apply it to a case to engaged or problem-driven philosophy. And the last years, we also see increasingly that we are really having debates and work on what those methods exactly are. And here, I mean, Joe has done, I think, the most important work in several of his papers, and also, of course, in the work, in the two books with Avner and a paper they have in print on dynamic public reflective equilibrium. I hope I have that order right. The dynamic in the public. Okay, so I want, in the time that I have left, defend 3 claims about these methods, because I am a convicted card-carrying member of this engaged philosophy clan, but I do think we have work to do. I actually hope Joe's not really retiring, but I don't know. But because we have work to do. The first thing is really a small quibble I have, or a small thing I want to discuss. I actually prefer the term real-world political philosophy that Joe used in some of his writing. I found it in the 2020 paper, more than the word engaged political philosophy. I don't know why, maybe because engaged triggers some connotation to me also, perhaps as a non-native speaker. I just wonder, engaged with what? You can also just engage with the history of political philosophy, whereas real world kind of makes it clear, we are in the real world, actually the world is in flames, we have all these problems, what can we contribute as political philosophers? But I'm just pointing this here, so in the break you can come and convince me that engaged actually is the right word. Then I think the second 2 things are just really, I think it's nothing original, I'm just trying to pull from the literature what I think is emerging. The choice of the methods we use should be a function of what we are aiming to achieve with our philosophical work. Call that the goals. That's clear in Joe's work. David Miller has written about it. Many of us do this. But that means that especially if we also teach political philosophy, or if we try to mentor or supervise junior philosophers, then we have to give a bit more substance to this claim. And that brings me to claim 3. I think we still have work to do in spelling out and developing those methods, and then also really making our methods much more explicitly. And this is something on which I have been, I've been thinking about this for a long time. First of all, because in the country where I live, if you don't constantly write grant applications, you can no longer really do serious research. So that means I've spent a lifetime writing grant applications, and you have this methodology section. You're in competition with people from, but it's as ordinary as this. But we know how we do it. Why can't we explain it to the other sciences, other social science and humanities, who just refer to all their methods? And also sometimes when you do interdisciplinary research and you try to explain to your colleagues who do empirical research, they just look at us like, but what really are you doing? And you can try to tell it. And also there's also another reason, which is they do often crypto-normative analysis, which just means here are my intuitions and I apply them and then that's my method. So I really think it would help our discipline to do more methodological work explicitly. How many minutes do I have left? Because I can't see the clock. Oh, good. I'm relaxed. So what I propose is to fill in this toolbox of methods, to really just start spelling it out. And I know that for many philosophers, this is not, I mean, are we really going to do this? But just think of this as a typology, perhaps because typology is a respectable philosophical term. Perhaps I can get away with it like this. So what I did was I just sat down, thought about everything I've been reading in Joe's work in this whole literature, and just tried to spell out how I think we can structure this. And I came up with 10 different types of work and then tried to fill out what the methods are that people are using. But this is just the very first time I present this, so it may be wrong, it may be, I'm sure it's incomplete, so just take it for what it is. So I think the first thing we should do is develop the notions in a way that can be used in action guiding research. Because, for example, a good example is the notion of well-being or flourishing. You can have this in a very abstract way, or you can have this in a way that is philosophically, I think, very convincing, like thinking about desire fulfillment theories of well-being that have all sorts of epistemic requirements, but you can't really apply this in policymaking. So, and there's recent work also by Anna Alexandrova from Cambridge, who really also says we have different concepts for different purposes. So what are the methods you can then use to develop these notions? Well, I think something like empirically informed conceptual analysis, but also I think the method that Joe and Avner have written on and used, dynamic public reflective equilibrium, where you engage with those who are affected or those who are stakeholders and really go back and forth between practice and developing your concepts is very useful. So Avner and Joe used this in their book Disadvantage, and in the paper they wrote on dynamic public reflective equilibrium, they also say they use this in City of Equals. I have to confess I haven't read that book yet. So that's why I put it between brackets. You can't ask me questions about this. The second type of research in engaged political philosophy is critiquing harmful notions or biased perspectives in societal discourse. So you could say, okay, that's a bit of a different type of thing, but still I think it is what we need to do as political philosophers in society. That is, I mean, ideology critique, or you could say biases in scholarly reasoning. The example I thought was from Sally Haslanger, who critiques the notion of mother and father and says if you have the notion of parent, actually you're taking away gendered expectations and the ideology that comes with this. But I also had to think of course, the whole intervention by disability scholars, and I know that Joe has done also important work on this, or feminist scholars or other scholars who work for either on or for marginalized perspectives, has often been to show how the mainstream has just forgotten about certain aspects of human diversity and so on. And actually, the book that you mentioned, Alice, where Joe has an important chapter on the canon, which the Pluralizing Political Philosophy book tries to bring those voices together. So I do think this is also something we have to do, even though what we are doing here is not advising policymaking, we're often critiquing policymaking in society and ourselves. So I don't know what the method, I mean, the method is just critique. I don't know whether that's good enough, but it's the best I could come up with as the method of what we use. The third is, and Joe has an explicit paper on this, drawing attention to values under pressure, or you could say values that are overemphasized. So in the paper Joe wrote in 2015 on real-world political philosophy and the welfare state, or political philosophy and the real world of the welfare state, so something like that. He says this. This is like, in the welfare state, we overemphasized personal responsibility, we've underemphasized solidarity, so that is, I think, an important contribution we can also make. A fourth goal could be pragmatic advice for the next step in improving an institution or policy. So I use institutions and policy interchangeably. This is really like, you have a policymaker, what is the next thing they can do? Here, the method should be absolutely feasibility sensitive, and I think in the two aspects of feasibility, and empirically informed normative analysis. And an example here is in a debate on inheritance taxation, where Joe engaged with the Rogano method, which I think is unfeasible. Yeah, so it's a nice idea, but we're never going to have it. Joe argues that in a certain context in the UK, actually, the thing to do, first of all, is reducing exemptions. I had a little quibble in my work on inheritance that I said, well, this is not ambitious enough. So I do think this needs to be done. Sometimes this is the only thing you can do, but I'll come to other things one could do. So, but it's, I think what the crucial thing is with this engaged political philosophy is really to ask yourself, what am I doing right now? So what is the purpose of what I'm doing? And it's totally fine that you know I'm going to do something very limited and pragmatic because that's the thing to do now. I'll do something more ambitious and more utopian another day, or somebody else will do it, but to make those distinctions in the goals of our work clear. Then you have the policy advice to the government serving on committees. Here, of course, I mean, I don't know anybody who's written better on this than Joe in his book on ethics and public policy. And it's also in the second edition where he reflects on engaged philosophy as a method. And what I think is very interesting and what my students really like when I tell them this, I mean, when I teach your book to them, is that sometimes it's actually our philosophical skills that we take to those committees, rather than that we have like very particular knowledge. So that is and there, if you're serving on such a committee, you have to know that's what you're doing. You're not going to come and present them utopia. It's another job for another day. The sixth possibility is to empower citizens to make normatively well-informed decisions on a institution. So this is actually the fourth, where I said pragmatic advice for improving the institution. I think we can go further and just lay out all the values and all the things at stake, and then, but be a bit more ambitious than just saying, okay, we have to close the loopholes or increase the capacity of for compliance investigations. So I think actually this is what many of us are doing. We just haven't spelled out this method properly. And also the problem, because I tried to do this for inheritance and gifts taxation in a paper, the first time I submitted that paper, the comment of the referee was, no, you can't do this. It's too much. Because I say it has to be comprehensive analysis, so I draw on all these other work by scholars, and then the thing is, no, you pick one and you go as deep as you can. And I really think we need to make the point, that's fine, but at some point we have to pull it all together, synthesize. The difference between the sixth and the seventh that I'll now get to is that I think you can do this in two modes. Either you present it to the citizens, tell them which values and principles are at stake, and let them make the choice. Or you can do that and also say, by the way, I think, given all these considerations, this is the design that does most justice to the weighing of the different values. So you have different options. And I just think it's important to, again, be clear about what you're trying to do. All right, then the eighth type of work we can do is explicating what is valuable in a practice, or possibly also disvaluable. I think the method should say I'm not entirely sure, phenomenologically grounded normative analysis. I have to think of papers like Lisa Herzog and Anka Geusch, who wrote a very nice paper on what are the goods of work in addition to earning money. They really try to say, okay, what is valuable about work? And if you see how these types of papers are done, people really, you have to have experience with those practices. I mean, you can do similar, you can do this with any practice that we have or any aspects of our being. What is important is to have the kind of skills and sensitivity to really see, in a philosophical sense, what's happening in a context. So perhaps that the dynamic public reflective equilibrium might also play a role here. But I think still there is something about Perhaps even bringing in literature might tease out some of these aspects. A 9 type of work we can do, and I'm almost there because I have 10, is drawing attention. Oh, haven't we? Oh, no, this is another one. Drawing attention to public issues that have not received enough attention. Again, we need empirically informed and feasibility sensitive argumentation. I think Joe's recent work, one in the Inheritance paper and one in a piece in Philosophy magazine, on inequalities in retirement. Of course, one could say, yeah, but we have inequalities between all groups, but sometimes we really need to draw attention to a particular subgroup or where we may just not have paid enough attention. I think that's also a role that engaged political philosophers could play. Finally, before some of you become very worried, we still have to do the kind of real utopia. Actually, I really value this, and I'm doing this myself, so I'm absolutely not saying that this should come as an afterthought. We should stretch the political imagination, which is what I think we do when we make those real utopia. You could also see it as shifting the Overton window. I think it's normative argumentation, again, empirically grounded, but here the feasibility constraint only covers one of those 2 aspects, and I'm here grateful to Philip for discussing this just 2 weeks ago when we, in another workshop, had a discussion about how this feasibility falls into those 2 aspects. And I think Philip's own work is as a good example. The work on universal basic income is really trying to stretch the political imagination of what would be possible. I don't think this is all. I do think it would be worthwhile trying to make our methods and our agenda explicit. So to have this typology. I know that some people think, oh, this is boring. Why do we need to list? There is a tendency in philosophy to think lists are crude and so on. But I really think we're doing our own discipline a disservice by not spelling this out. So thank you all for listening, and for Joe for your contributions to political philosophy. Thank you.
We get Noah's artwork in the back. But anyway, I think echoing others, it's a real privilege and honor to speak at such a wonderful occasion. In preparing for my talk today, I was rereading a paper that was relevant that Joe wrote about 25 years ago called Contractualism and the Virtues. And in that, he considers how we might rescue virtue ethics from the twin vices of narcissism and priggishness. The topic of that paper, as I said, is relevant to what I want to say, but there was a passing example that I wanted to read where Joe says, "The ambition to write a book of philosophy that will still be read when one is dead," and I know we're not at a funeral, may seem reasonable enough to people reading these words. Making this goal the center of one's life in the sense that everything else must be made to fit around it is understandable, but perhaps in more than one sense, unbalanced. And I thought this is, sort of classic Joe. And I think that sense of perspective, what you might call balance, is really, has led Joe sort of to working against the sort of egotistic and narrow ambitions that some philosophy might prioritize, has really led, interestingly and paradoxically, to the kind of work and legacy that is enduring, both in terms of scholarship, but also teaching, and of course public philosophy, not least through, we should say, Blue Sky, not Twitter anymore, or the unnamed other platforms. And so it's a real joy to speak today. And Joe has relentlessly kind of been concerned with the human condition in all his work. And I think, others might have a different view, but perhaps is the greatest analytic philosopher to emerge from the analytic tradition, to really be sensitive to the human condition as it manifests itself in the sort of daily life of people. And I think that is a really remarkable kind of achievement. So in terms of what I want to focus on, Ingrid's done an amazing job to give us a sense of the engaged approach, and I want to build on that by adding just a modest proposal, maybe not modest, but sort of a specific proposal to say that we could consider how we can make one of the purposes of engaged philosophy to specifically focus on questions of moral agency. So, as has been well described, Joe was keen to move away or draw a contrast to being wedded to a type of applied philosophy that seeks to apply abstract philosophical theory to public challenges. And he notes that this leads to a series of problems that, I don't need to go through all of them, but the approach then that he offers in engaged philosophy, I reconstruct it to have several benefits, but three of them that I want to highlight. One is that it sees knowledge as a whole, and so it enables philosophical contributions to work alongside and in complementary ways to other forms of knowledge, and I think this is extremely valuable. And then, of course, as has been well shown, it connects knowledge to practical action in realistic ways. And I think something that is sort of taken for granted in this room is, of course, that it takes values and ethics to be assumed to be at stake. And we would all agree on that. But in the actual work of public policy and government, this is actually working against the kind of technocratic grain or technocratic assumptions that are infused in the daily work of governments often. So by sort of making that a sort of obvious point in a way, Joe's made a very valuable, somewhat radical contribution to the sort of thinking about the daily work of making public policy. But something that I think is underdeveloped is, in terms of its central focus, is questions of moral agency. And I think here, in terms of the importance of this, we might think of someone like Raymond Geuss, who in a characteristic way chastises liberals for the fantasy of being an entirely sovereign individual. He says, it would seem obvious that such a fantasy is a reaction to massive anxiety about real issues of agency in the world. The fear is perfectly justified in the world we live in, and so the fantasy is clearly connected to the satisfaction of a real need, even if the form the satisfaction takes is illusory. And we might also think about questions of agency in light of dominant or very prominent policy discourses like polycrisis, which seeks to try and explain the complexity and the interconnectedness of problems, but can have this sort of unintended effect of being extremely disempowering and making things feel like they're overwhelming, and therefore it's hard to think of what we can do about them. So I want to suggest, now just offer a sketch, and I'm not going to actually do the methodological work, but just to set it up and say, I think there's an opportunity to think about what would an engaged philosophy of moral agency look like, drawing on the work that Joe's done to lay that out explicitly. And by foregrounding agency, I think I'm thinking about it on two levels. One is the policymakers themselves, who are actually the primary audience of this kind of work. But the bit that I think is less developed is thinking about the wider universe of agents, including citizens just as citizens. And I think the methodological approach here could be extremely valuable to addressing both the sort of human dimension of policymakers and regulators and so on, but also this wider universe of agents and how they might engage in responding to or how they approach public problems. So the question is something like, how do we empower more people as co-creators of solutions or responses to public problems. And the reason I'm sort of thinking about this way is in doing my doctoral work with Joe, I found the applied engaged distinction extremely helpful for thinking about the question of what I call globalized kleptocracy, or the movement of stolen assets or corrupt assets across borders, and why there's so little sensitivity to the injustice of that and sort of modest real-world responses. And Joe's cut around applied and engaged was extremely apt, because basically the global justice literature treats this, and I think Ingrid also acknowledged this recently in her book, in a chapter in her wonderful new book. It's almost like there's nothing to say, because it's so obviously morally wrong. And all the global justice theories from different perspectives, or even the sort of more national-based sort of moral thinking about global problems, all would basically say, this is completely wrong. Here is there's sort of, we can make some distinctions about where obligations might lie and so on, but basically there's nothing much to say philosophically. The engaged approach was far more fruitful, but even then, the actual policymakers and activists engaged on this issue sort of are kind of following the basic moral setup or that philosophers would offer. And so I thought something else is going on. And as soon as you start looking at real-world questions around agency, who's involved in this ecosystem? What are their motivations? What's the psychology? What's the emotional component here? Why are people finding it hard to make these connections and so on? As soon as you look at the question of agency, the engaged approach becomes extremely fruitful. And it reveals lots of pathways for better moral analysis and, I think, practical solution building. So that's kind of my motivation for this work. So what's my main argument? It's basically to say that we needed engaged philosophy of moral agency, and that this can draw on Joe's approach. For example, we can help develop this by resisting dogmatism about the way agents might want to draw on different values in approaching public problems. We can start with problems themselves and then look at ways that agents might want to chart a course in their own life or in their own work to respond to those public problems. And we want to value epistemic humility in the way agents might want to combine sort of moral thinking with other forms of understanding of a problem to try and respond to it effectively. So, just as with Joe making explicit this sort of methodology, I think making this explicit in relation to moral agency is also valuable. So what would be the sort of benefit of this? I think it's two dimensions. One is to help make better progress on these problems. We get a better mapping of power dynamics. We get a chance to think about how we can contribute to mapping, but also raising what Amir Srinivasan calls moral sensitivity. And these turn out to be extremely important to overcoming the blockages to how we actually solve public problems. But there's a second dimension as well, which is I think it's a contribution to helping more people to live good lives by trying to create more ways that they can actually be part of addressing some of these public problems as a part of a fully flourishing life for themselves. In terms of how we might go about this, it might be helpful to just relax some of the distinction that Joe draws between sort of short, what he calls status quo policy kind of work versus status quo public opinion work, in the sense that agents might want to contribute in ways that are more aligned with the longer arc of history through social movements and other forms of activism. Of course, there's very powerful examples in Joe's own work of how we might go about this. I mean, the example of the disability advocates, which I think there's discussion of later today, the way Joe uses this to sort of demolish to show the philosophical sophistication, the practical insight, the ethical insight of people actually working in that space, versus at the time, the kind of dominant philosophers of equality and justice, and the asymmetry between these two it was a very powerful example of the sort of thing I'm thinking of, which is when we look at the question of agents who are actually trying to address these problems, we reveal, it's extremely generative. In terms of my reasoning here, I think there's both a philosophical plank of work to build on, but also if we think about cutting-edge forms of policy making, it's very bumpy and uneven, but things like co-design with citizens, co-production or co-delivery of solutions with citizens are actually considered in many ways to be at the forefront of good modern policy making. And we can think of this sort of new type of statecraft that's in the work of people like Hilary Cottam on radical help, thinking about how to get serious about sort of relationship building in this delivery and the way services are done in collaboration with citizens, and also prioritizing capability building in the way states actually conduct the welfare state. We can think of it as also in Mariana Mazzucato's work on missions, which is really about government finding ways to crowd in more players, both human level but also group agents, to try and contribute to solving public problems. And there are others, including around like place-based economic strategies, people like Dani Rodrik and Chuck Sable looking at good job strategies, and so on. So there's this sort of existing public policy developments that we can build on. And the second is, of course, a flourishing philosophical work around these questions, including in Joe's work and with Avner Shalit in A City of Equals, for example, where they talk about another description, bottom-up moral and political reasoning, where they invite, I think one of the things they do implicitly is invite us to think about ourselves as citizens, and to think about how more people can contribute to addressing this question of how to build more equal cities. At the end of the day, policymakers are the focus, but I think there is a huge opening there for thinking about the role of people, groups, associations, and so on. And if you think about a challenge like snobbery or servility that they highlight, there's a way in which agents themselves can think about how they can address these kind of moral concerns in the life of a city, and then that gets hooked up to institutional concerns around policy reform, around structural change that can, if you like, reduce levels of snobbery. So that's one example. But there are, of course, many others. Iris Marion Young famously, with a lot of work has been spent trying to look at her concept of structural injustice. But of course, the motivation was very much also about how to prioritize individual agency or individual responsibility, in the face of structural injustice. And others have built on that. In the global justice literature, we have Leah Yuppie's work on avant-garde political agency, and Lior and Cécile Laborde have a terrific article, for example, on cosmopolitan patriotism, where they reflect on this sort of virtues and characteristics of citizens who come to value certain things in the life of their own national context, such as ideals of non-domination, and how they want to see those ideals thrive globally. And I think these are kind of the sort of really valuable openings in the global justice literature. We have Melissa Lane's work, really challenging notions of how we think about feasibility in relation to social change through her work on negligibility in action on climate change. We have, I don't have obviously time to go into the details of these works. We have Martha Nussbaum's work on political emotions. And then we have the anthropologically informed work of people like Bernardo Zacca. At a deeper level too, Danielle Allen is developing, or has developed this sort of democratic theory of justice, which is, or what she calls a power-sharing liberalism that seeks to root out patterns of domination. And the closing chapter of that book goes back to the question of a new model of citizenship, and it's all about how do citizens see, as part of a fully flourishing life, how do they come to see themselves as co-creators of solutions or responses to some of these big public problems? So we have a lot to work on from public policy developments and philosophical developments to help address these kind of questions. And so what would be engaged philosophy's contribution? I think it would be to be sharper and to illuminate questions of virtues, emotions, public, moral cultivation, psychology, and so on, that can really help agents situate themselves as responders to some of these big challenges in the world. Give two examples of where there might be openings. One is questions of social roles. So Robin Zeng, in her work responding to Iris Marion Young, really says roles are where structure meets agency. And what's interesting about roles is how widely distributed they are, how they come with inbuilt expectations and possibilities for doing the role well, and so on. And if you think about agency manifested in roles, suddenly you've got sort of so much material to work with in the professions, in organizations, citizens as citizens. You have possibilities of across the board. I think of my own daughter, for example. I was extremely worried. She's 3 years old. When we had our son, I was extremely worried she'd be very jealous and very upset, basically, that there would be this tension. And for a variety of reasons, she's been very loving and caring so far. But one of them, I'm convinced, is she's latched onto this idea of her role as a bigger sister. And so it's opened up this sort of moral possibilities for her and is extremely helpful to the functioning of our family. Of course, there is, there's also interesting work, for example, I'm not a gamer, but there's amazing philosophical work by C.T. Nguyen in the United States on the philosophy of games, and particularly, I think, video games. And one of the things in his work on games, he points out, is the way games are this sort of artificial construction in which people can sort of train themselves on questions of agency in the game, including in relation to social transformation. So that philosophical work has really illuminated the power of games as one tool. We often think about civic education and so on, but thinking about games as a site of developing agency, it's really taken a philosophical intervention to really try and understand that. Of course, it's happening in the games themselves, but once it's called out and articulated by that philosophical work, then you can imagine there's more possibilities for thinking about genuine creative use of games as a site of agency building. I was struck recently by reading an essay where Kwame Anthony Appiah reflects on his work in the Honor Code around the fact that he basically says, he neglected questions of social identity. He didn't put them centrally in focus. And I think that book was incredibly interesting. But that reflection of his really highlights this potential value and potential missed opportunities of missing moral agency. So recently he's offered a little bit of a corrective, and he said, look, there's really interesting ways in which these identities formed in the abolitionist movement in the UK, in Britain, in the 1830s, where he says, why do so many people get inspired to participate in this movement? And he said they came to see themselves as abolitionists. That was the sort of overarching identity. But then he offers several other identities that were hugely relevant as Britain. So the point about as a national identity, they came to be, they wanted to be part of an abolitionist movement. They saw it as anathema to their national values. Their regional identities, people in Birmingham, the way they came to see it is against their regional identity. Of course, there's the evangelical Christian dimension, which was not an afterthought, but was built into the very core of how many abolitionists and abolitionist leaders saw their role as abolitionists. And then there was the working class identity, where there was a shift in the way the working class here came to associate themselves with the plight of the slave and the degradation of work through the institution of slavery. And so Appiah sort of illuminates these different ways that people can come to connect themselves to some sort of, in this case, sort of one of, a sort of historical great public problem. But I think a version of this is relevant in general, And of course, it's much easier to do this, it's hard and messy to do it historically, but even harder and more messy to do it in a forward-looking way. But I think that's the challenge. And I think the welfare state is a good example of where there might be fruit in doing this. Thinking about, for example, Hilary Cottam's work on radical help and what it would look like to have more people, for example, not positioned as beneficiaries of welfare, but as active participants in addressing the sort of challenges of their family and their community, and how the state and how policy can enable that. I think philosophers have a huge role and have to contribute to that kind of discussion. So that's it. I mean, in terms of the broader significance, I mean, it's huge. But just to go back to that question of agency and a sense of sort of hopelessness that is in many ways many people might be feeling, I do think this is part of how we might respond to that. And I just close by, I was reading Wendy Brown's work on nihilism and nihilistic times. She says, in an age dominated by instrumental rationality, reason alone only adds calculation or rationalization to any aim. Passion combined with instrumental reason leads to the most dangerous political tendency, in which ends justify means, and everything, laws, individuals, religions, principles, may be instrumentalized or degraded for purposes inimical to their original value. Not calculative reason then, but a distinctive ethic of responsibility for all effects of an action, especially collateral and unintended ones, is required to guide and temporize without choking political passion. And I think what I've been trying to address is how we build this sense of ethic of responsibility for a time that is marked by nihilism and hopelessness in many ways, but not just for policymakers, but more broadly as a distributed ethic.
Okay, thank you both. We've now kind of got 20 minutes in which both I and with you, Ingrid, and you, Vafa, can engage, but also the room as a whole. We've got 20 minutes for all of us to really just go into this and engage with what Vafa and Ingrid have just said. And so if anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we can jump straight in. If you're still having time to think what those questions might be, then I will begin. Yeah. Was there a question? No? So I think, two things that come to mind for me, Vafa, is you're talking about having moral agents and moral agency. And my mind, don't call me a cynic, but my mind immediately goes to immoral agents. Now, I work on climate change, and in climate change there is a large degree of what people might call immoral agents that are actively engaging with policymakers on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. You might think of some large conglomerates, perhaps. How would you engage with that aspect, or how do we deal with these actors?
Yeah. Well, I think methodologically it's helpful in the sense that we can identify that in political philosophy. That's helpful, and power, and making power more a sort of part of the analysis is one way. But I think what I'm more interested in is the positive side of the ledger. So, if you think about what are the effective responses to that. So I mentioned Melissa Lane's work, for example. She goes to great lengths to try and make the case that very ordinary commitments by people making very small commitments on climate action matters a great deal, because we can't really discount the ways in which that then affects social order and social transformation. And actually, social order and social transformation relies on this sort of groundswell of activity of people. So then the question is, you've got to do both, but how do you build the positive response? And something like climate change, it does feel like it has a real risk of fatigue and of moral fatigue or commitments, where people, and I think fear, for example, is important but not enough as a motivation. So how do you do that? Well, lots of branches of knowledge can contribute to that, but philosophers might be one powerful way, particularly in the sense of like, who else can offer articulations of like how people build in these big structural questions into their daily lives.
Oh, now we've got lots. Yeah, first, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a question about engaged. Ooh, sorry. Thanks. So I have a question about engaged philosophy and a problem that I guess arises in the context of doing engaged philosophy that hasn't been touched upon, but that bugs me. So I'm just going to take advantage of your expertise. And this is the following. I mean, it's related to engaged philosophy. I don't know whether it exactly fits the category. So suppose that you develop a good philosophical argument, one that looks quite plausible. I don't know, I am quite taken, for instance, by the non-identity problem. However, if you publicize the argument, perhaps amongst the wrong crowds, if you, I don't know, write an article in The Guardian on the non-identity problem, you've not done that, I'm not recommending that anyone does that, but you know, and because you're convinced that it is a good argument, of course it might be taken the wrong way, so well, you know, you're not violating the rights or harming any particular individual in future generations, therefore, right? So what should we do with philosophical arguments that, given what people are like, if made available to the broader public, though we might think that actually that's what we should be doing if we care about the truth or whatever, might have problematic implications or are likely to be misused in certain ways. So do we have a responsibility, if you know we care about making the world better, to police our own, I don't know, publication or even philosophizing choices because of these risks?
I'm happy to
First,
take that one. Because I engage a lot with the public, and I'm also kind of a bit of a skeptic of the value of the non-identity problem and similar types of work for the public sphere. I mean, and I guess it's really about the question we just always reason from our own heads. We reason from our shared norms as academic political philosophers. But you know, the world outside doesn't care about us. And it's also there, no, but seriously, I sometimes think we just lose touch also like, so there are a couple of things. I'll try to say two different things. One is, some distinctions that we draw are just irrelevant for practice. And if we can't make it clear to the public how they are relevant, then I really think we should question our own position. The second is, it may also be that sometimes it is in an idealized world with all sorts of background assumption that it is a truth, but actually it's not a truth in the world. So there's all sorts of things, but I just sometimes think we have our own norms of what is good and good philosophy that doesn't fit on society. On the other hand, the thing about, I think censoring is really, we should avoid it as much as we can, but you can, therefore, the wording you use is extremely important. And of course, if we believe we're in the business of producing eternal truths, then we go in it like, okay, I'm going to tell you what the eternal truth is, but that's not my view on truth. So I guess, but I also have to say that I think it's easier for some types of political philosophy to do this than for others. One example where I think this has may have gone really wrong is that often most of our analyses are not comprehensive. We just go for one argument. And of course, in the back of our heads, we know this is only one argument, you have to wait with all the other arguments. But then this qualifier gets lost when we go to the public domain. I actually advise all my colleagues who want to start reaching out to really take media training. Because the media is a different world and we can't go in there assuming that it's like our world. I mean, this doesn't address all the questions. But I also think sometimes, I mean, the world, there's lots of evil people in the world, so they will really try, and also a strong anti-intellectualist movement, now definitely with the rise of, can I say fascists? Yes, I can say fascists. I think we have, that they will of course try to undermine, because they're actually actively undermining universities, and they undermine critical voices, so they undermine philosophers. And so sometimes it may be best not to go out in the public domain because you're just feeding the beast. I know this is complicated, but...
I mean, one simple response, which is I think aligned here, is to say, well, this would be like a classic trap of applied philosophy, where you are trying to contribute to the public debate in a authentic, like it's a sort of well-intentioned way, but is sort of not taking seriously the current debates and the current values that are actually part of the response. So it's sort of, it is the kind of classic kind of dilemma that Joe offered. So one way to think about it is like, how would that relate to people in Kiribati, for example, who are trying to, sustain their country or the society or culture, or indigenous epistemologies that say, like, we are currently living in a period of dystopia. It's not like a future dystopia. Like, there's really interesting philosophical work on trying to suggest that climate change is not a future dystopia. It's actually, for indigenous people in the long arc of history, is actually currently, this is a tumultuous period that is infused with disruption, both ecological and cultural. And so just different ways of framing the situation, that if an intervention like that is sort of trying to ignore, then, that would be the problem, is a sort of methodological problem of how to contribute. Joe makes very clear that it's like a place for this stock of knowledge in grand theories and abstract philosophy, not trying to discount it, but then how we draw on that in these in the public sphere might matter. I 100% agree about not trying to ban it, or I think it shouldn't be sort of not allowed or anything like that. Yeah.
Yes, Joe, I feel like has priority for the, for the day.
Just exactly on this point. So one of the areas where I've come across this dilemma about, on the one hand, being as truthful as you can to what you believe to be the philosophical theory and how the world will take it, is in the area of the human right to health. And there I found that people who were skeptical about the human right to health were drawing on philosophical materials. Because people like Honora O'Neill, who being rather qualified in her support and putting forward arguments, it was those negative bits that were being picked up, not the positive bits. And so I proposed with some activists to have a conference on whether there's a human right to health. And the activists said, we don't want to ask that question. What we want to ask is, how do we develop and advocate for the human right to health? Because as soon as we make this look like a two sides issue, then it undermines all the work that we're doing. And so when I came to write about the human right to health, I was much more of an advocate for it without expressing any of my skepticism, because I thought that was a contribution that was needed at that time. And also, you don't say that either, because that undermines the work you're doing. It's in this case, slightly deceptive. And I gave a talk about this, and Catherine Hawley, who sadly died young, but she said the same thing is happening in science. So you have in the philosophy of science, you have philosophers who are putting out very skeptical theses. And so the anti-scientists, people in the anti-science movement are picking up just on those bits, right? So we've got a type of dual use problem in philosophy, like you have in technology as well. Okay.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit upon time. both the time that individuals might have to get involved in engaged philosophy and also the time that we have collectively to address really urgent critical problems, given that we might be having breakdowns of various sort. And then how that might connect to power and the relevant formations of power, or whether we need to imagine new forms of power in order to be able to help us to manage the limitations upon time and the urgency of time.
I'm sure you have, especially on climate change.
Keep in mind, we're in fact running out of time.
Okay.
So.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, it's a huge question. Two very sort of disjointed comments. One is the importance of public policies that can generate time for citizens to engage in this work, and to do that in ways that are coherent. So you can have sort of coherent with their life, that are fit with their life. So, you think about disability reform in Australia, for example, huge structural reforms in the welfare state, the biggest we've seen in decades, driven by, of course, families of people with disability. So for them, it's not it's a coherent, it fits with their life. But of course, you want to create more opportunities for people to be able to participate and to express that. And that requires public policy to dedicate itself to creating the economic conditions for that and creating opportunities for that. So, but I think that is definitely a worthwhile, critical role of public policy, is to think about that, and particularly economic policy, to think about economic policy not just about, anyway, we all know, so that's a huge part, is to create the economic security so that people can participate fully as a goal of economic policy. That should be the case, I think. The second is to say social roles. The point of that argument is to say that people are already in many roles, and so to illuminate the ways in which roles could be used to address public concerns is a way of sort of, in one way, to think about it, it's a very efficient way to contribute, because we are many roles. We're parents, we're teachers, we're neighbors, and so on. And so with all of these, if we see these as part of having a civic component, then suddenly there's much more possibilities to contribute.
Yeah, I'll just add one last small thing, which is when it concerns times of academic philosophers, we generally tend to have full autonomy over what we do, what we write. So that means you can decide whether you want to write a book or papers that are focusing on theories and that are theory-driven, or you go for the engaged approach. I think the problem is, but this is again just a kind of how I see the field, but that may be wrong, is that the status of the classical way of doing political philosophy is still higher. So the young people who are entering the field have incentives to publish in the highest ranked journals, which, as far as I can tell, will not publish this kind of work because it's too interdisciplinary, it doesn't have the same status, which is actually one of the reasons why I want to spell out this methodology, because I think this will help give it the credibility and deserved credibility, in my view, of being a serious way of doing philosophy. But I think interdisciplinary work, and engaged philosophy is not really interdisciplinary, but at least goes some way, always has it more difficult. But I am glad I really didn't spend my time in another way. But it is, I can understand that it comes with anxieties, especially given the academic world, how hard it is to get a good job in the end. Yeah.
How many questions are left? 1, 2, 3. I think we've got 3 minutes left. So what I might do is ask you to say your questions together, if that works, and then we can address all of them. So it was 1, and where are the other ones? 2.
Thank you. My question is about the positioning of philosophers in social engagement, because it seems that all of the problems are really related to whether the citizens still take public philosophers as an ideological authority. So the question is, do you think that explicating the very kind of ethical foundation for like philosophical engagement as philosophers, not only as a professional, but not as only as a group of intellectuals who are interested in these questions, but also as sort of a subdivision of the society who want to show more sort of solidarity and genuine kind of well-intentioned engagement would help. So I think there's also about sort of attitude of engagement with the public rather than the substance itself, not just sort of. Another aspect with it is
we'll have to leave it there and maybe pick it up in the break.
So it's the same. Do philosophers have to speak in the shoes of philosophers? Because I see, like, I'm from China, I see a lot of practice where, like, stand-up comedians actually are trained from philosophical background, but really bring attention, very important social issues to the audience. Yes, thank you.
Okay, and if the other two can keep their comment very brief.
So just a question about engaged philosophy. Obviously, it's not clear to me, and I think when I read Joe's stuff, I was a little unsure about this as well, as to whether engaged philosophy is a method in philosophy or a method for philosophers when they were in public. And I always understood it as the latter rather than the former. And I think there's been a bit of ambiguity in the discussion about that. And I think if it's the latter, as I thought it was, then it's about how to conduct yourselves in these things. Now, I think interestingly, where there's work to thought is, how does that then translate into how we do philosophy? And I think there are lessons there, but that's a different sort of project from this engaged philosophy, as described, I think.
And finally, yeah.
Yeah, so my question's about how you think engaged or real-world political philosophy interacts with teaching. So at least when I think about it, disproportionately, I think, the students we teach go on to become very powerful people. They become policy analysts, journalists, and things like that. So there's always this middle layer of, even if we're not directly addressing the public, but we're addressing people who are actually former philosophy students or majored in philosophy and things like that. So how is that both a resource for real-world political philosophy, and also how is that, in fact, just a kind of adequate way to do it, insofar as it's just the kind of people attracted to a philosophical education also are attracted to policy making and things like that? Thank you.
Great. You want to do a quick response?
1 minute, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll try. I think the question that you asked about is engaged philosophy engaging with the world, or is it a method for philosophy? So I think it's important. Actually, I don't know. We can look at Joe. He's of course not singularly. I've seen it as a way to doing philosophy, but that makes it much easier also to engage with the world. So because the people who do engaged philosophy are basically motivated by problems in the world, and that means that it follows that they will be more likely to also be interested in working with societal partners. And then you have the methods of engaged philosophy, which I try to focus on, which will include some methods where you really do things in the world, like the dynamic public reflective equilibrium. But you can also just do desk research, but your method is still different. You don't start with a theory and then apply it, but the one that I've tried to develop is you lay out all the relevant values, show how they relate to solving a problem or relate with an institutional design, and then show what's at stake. So you empower the citizens to make their own decisions. So I guess it's like, So I would actually think the answer to your question is it's both. And I don't see that, I think that is possible. Yeah, I mean, you can follow up in a break. On the question about whether the attitude of philosophers, and so I agree that there is in the end, and I really recommend people to reread the introduction to Joe's book on being a philosopher on all those committees. Serving on committees like that really kind of brings some humility. Because when we talk to each other, it's like who has the most clever argument or is able to demolish somebody else's argument. But in those committees, it's a different game. And that requires a different kind of attitude. But I do think we can play a role in different ways. For example, as I've mentioned, I think engaged philosophy doesn't claim to have the truth. On the other hand, if you're in a societal debate and you see that somebody says two things and they're inconsistent, you can just point it out. That's a truth, that it's inconsistent, and I still think it's our professional duty to point it out. On teaching, I think, I think there are ways, but I think it would also require, so there are specialized programs definitely at the master level that just go all the way for engaged philosophy. Then you just have basically an applied ethics program or something like that. And then you can, for example, do more with internships where they get this experience. So there are ways, but it should then be followed from a commitment to deliver a certain type of trained professional to society. And I'm happy to talk more later.
So very quickly, I think very aligned. On the point about philosophers as special, I think the paradox is that by this, what I think is Joe's sort of epistemic humility, the paradox is that that would have more ability to gain traction and have a positive influence. So by being more humble in the contribution alongside other forms of knowledge actually is what makes it possible to have a bigger contribution. So I think that's on that. And on the education point, I think I was reading work by Onara Neal recently where she's talking about the way sort of virtues and questions of duty, and she means duty in the sense of like patriotism type thing, sort of fell out of fashion, partly because of philosophical trends of those sort of questions being marginalized in the discipline. So I think, my own bias is to sort of to revitalize those both in the philosophical mainstream, but then also to be more comfortable teaching that not just in philosophy programs, but universities thinking about not just their contribution in terms of specialized knowledge and critical thinking, both of which are indispensable, but this third plank of what is the sort of social civic purpose of universities, and including in curriculum and pedagogy. So, yeah.
We are definitely out of time, and in fact over time. So please join me in thanking Vafa and Ingrid. Thank you all.